Afghanistan, a mountainous, landlocked country in Central Asia, has earned the reputation of being the graveyard of empires. Time and again, powerful nations have attempted to invade, control, and reshape Afghanistan, only to leave defeated, exhausted, or, at best, with limited success. From the armies of Alexander the Great to the Soviet Union, and most recently, the United States and its NATO allies, history has shown that Afghanistan is a land resistant to conquest. But why has Afghanistan proved historically impossible to conquer? One of the first factors to consider is Afghanistan's geography. The country's rugged mountainous terrain presents a natural defense against foreign invaders. The towering peaks of the Hindu Kush mountain range dominate much of the landscape, making it incredibly difficult for armies to advance and supply lines to be maintained. In many parts of Afghanistan, roads are scarce, and communication between regions is limited, meaning that even when a military force gains control of one area, they struggle to consolidate that power across the country. Historically, the lack of centralized infrastructure has made Afghanistan difficult to govern, as it's essentially a patchwork of valleys, each with its own communities and loyalties. This terrain gives local guerrilla fighters a massive advantage, as they know how to navigate the mountains and can disappear into them when threatened. The geography of Afghanistan also fosters another key factor in its resistance to conquest: its fiercely independent people. Afghanistan has long been home to a variety of ethnic groups, tribes, and communities, each with its own language, customs, and loyalties. The largest ethnic groups are the Pashtuns, Tajiks, Hazaras, and Uzbeks, but there are many more. These groups have often resisted centralization, preferring to maintain local autonomy. When a foreign power attempts to impose control, they are not just facing a single unified state, they are dealing with a mosaic of tribal and regional loyalties. This makes it much harder for invaders to establish long-term authority. Even when one group might be willing to collaborate with an occupying force, others might see that as a betrayal and turn to resistance. Another reason for Afghanistan's historical resistance to conquest is the warrior culture of its people. Throughout history, Afghanistan has produced generations of fighters who are accustomed to defending their land. The Afghan people have developed strategies and tactics that take full advantage of their environment, using guerrilla warfare to harass and wear down much larger, more technologically advanced armies. Afghan fighters have a long tradition of fighting foreign invaders, from the British in the 19th century to the Soviets in the 20th century, and their knowledge of asymmetric warfare has allowed them to hold their own against overwhelming odds. In addition to geography and tribal resistance, the religious and cultural factors play a significant role in Afghanistan's resilience. Islam has been a unifying force for much of the Afghan population, and foreign invaders have often been seen not just as political or military occupiers, but as religious enemies. The idea of jihad, or holy struggle, has often motivated Afghans to fight against foreign invaders. This religious dimension has given Afghan resistance movements a sense of purpose and cohesion, even when their tribes or regions were divided on other issues. The Taliban, for instance, used religious rhetoric to rally support during their fight against the Soviet occupation in the 1980s, and again against the US-led coalition in the 21st century. History is littered with examples of foreign powers trying and failing to conquer Afghanistan. Take Alexander the Great, one of history's most successful military leaders. Even after Alexander's armies had swept through much of the known world, they faced fierce resistance in Afghanistan. While Alexander did manage to establish some control over parts of the region, his forces suffered heavy losses, and the resistance he encountered foreshadowed the struggles that other invaders would face in the centuries to come. The British Empire also learned this lesson the hard way. In the 19th century, during what became known as the Anglo-Afghan Wars, the British attempted to expand their influence in Afghanistan as part of the Great Game against Russia. Despite their military superiority, the British suffered catastrophic defeats, most famously during the First Anglo-Afghan War in 1842, when nearly an entire British expeditionary force of 16,000 troops and civilians was wiped out during their retreat from Kabul. The British would later return in 2 more Anglo-Afghan wars, but they were never able to establish lasting control over the country. The Soviet Union, a global superpower at the height of its strength, faced a similar fate in Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan to prop up a friendly communist government that was struggling to maintain power. The Soviet military, one of the most powerful in the world at the time, expected a quick and decisive victory. Instead, They found themselves mired in a brutal guerrilla war against the Mujahideen, Afghan fighters who were supported by the United States, Pakistan, and other countries. The mountainous terrain, the decentralized nature of Afghan resistance, and the Mujahideen's use of guerrilla tactics all contributed to the Soviet Union's eventual withdrawal in 1989. The war not only resulted in devastating losses for the Soviet military, but also contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. In the early 21st century, the United States and NATO embarked on their own mission in Afghanistan. Initially to remove the Taliban from power and dismantle al-Qaeda following the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Like the Soviets before them, the US and its allies quickly found that military victories in Afghanistan were hard to sustain. While they had managed to topple the Taliban government and set up a new Afghan administration, the insurgency continued to grow. The Taliban used their knowledge of the terrain and local support to wage a protracted guerrilla war, similar to the Mujahideen's fight against the Soviets decades earlier. After nearly 2 decades of fighting, the US and NATO forces eventually withdrew, with the Taliban regaining control of much of the country. So why has Afghanistan been so difficult to conquer? The answer lies in a combination of geography, tribalism, guerrilla tactics, and the cultural and religious motivations of its people. Afghanistan's mountains create natural barriers to invaders. Its decentralized society resists foreign control, and its fighters are adept at using the land to their advantage. Add to that a long history of resisting foreign occupation, and it's clear that Afghanistan is more than just another nation on the map. It's a place where empires go to die. Afghanistan's history teaches us that military strength alone is rarely enough to subdue a country with such a unique combination of factors working in its favor. It remains to be seen whether Afghanistan will continue to resist outside influence in the future, but if history is any guide, the graveyard of empires will remain unconquered.